Yet suddenly religion and science collided. John Scopes, a young teacher of Tennessee, had taught, contrary to state law, Darwin's theory of evolution. The Tennessee country people believed this was contrary to biblical doctrine, and Scopes' trial got worldwide publicity, with the Tennessee fundamentalists lined up against the liberals and intellectuals of America. William Jennings Bryant, old and full of oratory, defended the beliefs of the fundamentalists. He was aided by the prosecuting zeal of old Judge Ben McKenzie, a local politician influential in the area, who helped to make the trial an inquisition. The courtroom was packed as the case reached a climax. Arthur Garfield Hayes, defending Scopes, explained Darwin's theory of evolution, and Dudley Field Malone, another liberal, added his plea for tolerance to the cause of freedom of thought. Then the defense threw in another artful veteran, Clarence Darrow, for what turned out to be the cross-examination of Bryant. Darrow, in the shirt sleeves analysis, reduced the elder statesman's antiquated ideas to intellectual rubble. But still the court found Scopes guilty, and so ended a preposterous case.
On the political scene, there had been some changes. Harding's death came as a great shock to the nation. It was entirely unexpected, and the American people sincerely and affectionately mourned the passing of this kind and friendly man. Now Calvin Coolidge became the nation's chief executive. He was an old-fashioned Yankee, acid and thrifty, hardly the type you would expect to find in professional politics. Soon after he became president, certain well-hidden irregularities of the Harding administration began to be revealed. The chief scandal concerned the secret lease of government-owned naval oil fields. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, had been induced to lease an oil field to the Mammoth Oil Company, headed by Harry F. Sinclair, already a millionaire oil magnate. Bit by bit, other truths came out. Some from Fall's friend, Playboy Ed McLean, in testimony before a congressional investigating committee. Enormous bribes were revealed, but in the end, the acaparious Fall got off with a fine and a year in jail. The scandals of the Harding regime never touched Coolidge. He was incorruptible, and in 1924, he was elected president in his own right. The vice presidency went to the eminent Charles Gates Dawes, Chicago banker, who had helped to set up the United States government's present budget system. Now the Republicans had really come to town, and at the inaugural ball, they celebrated in style. They had an honest, careful man in the White House, Dawes to be a popular figure, and Hughes to lend his dignity to the administration, and business was booming.
Especially it boomed in Florida, a fine place to go for a winter vacation. Elaborate hotels were being built, and the city of Miami throve mightily. Soon people all over the country were buying Florida house lots and immediately selling them at huge profits. A rush to get to the new El Dorado began, and the pioneers couldn't wait for houses to be built. They had to be in on the ground floor, and they didn't mind such minor inconveniences as the lack of a roof over one's head. It didn't matter where you lived. When you were within reach of those dazzling profits, you and your family might become millionaires overnight. Pyramiding publicity with the stress on girls, girls, and more girls helped to keep the boom alive. Then the smash-up came, and then a hurricane, hit Florida, wrecking the waning dreams of the last speculators. But Florida wasn't done for. Miami wasn't done for. Slowly they recovered to build again on a more rational basis. But the great Florida land boom was over. It had been quite a binge. If Florida had been struck a temporary blow, most of the rest of the country hummed with prosperity and was having itself a good time, welcoming distinguished visitors, for instance. Among these was the Prince of Wales, an attractive young man, heir to the British crown and a veteran with a good war record. He liked to enjoy the pleasures of the rich and was much in demand among them, being the world's most eligible bachelor. When he came to the United States, New York had hardly learned how to stage a really razzle-dazzle welcome. That we had mastered a few years later, when the great ship Leviathan steamed into New York Harbor with Queen Marie of Romania aboard. She was a decorative lady, undeniably a queen, and her welcome set a standard for all future distinguished visitors. First came the parade up Broadway at the noon hour when you could always raise a crowd. Then came the official greeting by Mayor Jimmy Walker on the steps of City Hall.
There were other attractions, too. Those were really the golden days for sports fans. The Giants trained at Sarasota, and the Giants were always good. Frankie Frisch was among the idols, and you could always count on their manager, John J. McGraw, being on hand to run things. The Dodgers trained at Clearwater, Florida, coached by Ben Egan, with Zach Wheat as captain and Wilbert Robinson as manager. Tarpon Springs was one training ground of the St. Louis Browns, and they had one of the best of the old-timers, George Sisler, their player-manager. When the season really got underway, there were other headliners: Williams, Hornsby, and Killither of the Cardinals, and Walter Johnson of the Senators, and Mays of the Yankees. But the best of them all was Babe Ruth. When he wrapped his hands around the bat and got his feet set right, great things could happen. In the 1927 World Series, Wilcie Moore pitched for the Yankees and Carmen Hill for the Pirates. Judge Landis and Colonel Jake Rupert were on hand. That was the year the Babe knocked out 60 home runs, and the Yankees won the series in 4 straight games. There were other record breakers. Bobby Jones, an Atlanta, Georgia boy, who was to win the British Open and the British Amateur, and the same year take the American Open and the American Amateur Championships. A clean sweep of the field. Bobby had iron control, especially with that putter of his, Calamity Jane. Then there was Man o' War, one of the great race horses of all time. As a 2-year-old, Big Red started in 10 races, won 9 of them, and came in second in the one race he didn't win. As a 3-year-old, he started 11 times, won 11 times. Earl Sandy was the top money jockey. He won so often it got to be a habit. Polo was in its heyday, with boxes at $275 apiece. And the international matches were the great events in that magnificent sport. A hard one to beat for speed, coordination, and horsemanship. turned out some stars who'll never be forgotten. Red Grange of Illinois, the galloping ghost, was almost impossible to stop. Knute Rockne, Notre Dame's great coach, was on the crest of the wave. It wasn't often that Rock's teams lost a game. The East had its stars, too. Babe Ruth of Yale was one of the best running backs the game produced. In those days, they were hanging up new records on the track. Nermi, the Flying Finn, raced with a stopwatch in his hand. Johnny Weissmuller was another natural athlete. His record of 51 seconds for the 100-yard freestyle stood untouched for 16 years. That made him the fastest swimmer in the world. The champion water baby Americans really went wild about was a girl, Gertrude Ederle, the first woman to swim the English Channel. It took her only 14 and a half hours, a new record. And when Trudy got home, New York went wild. This 18-year-old girl had succeeded where several men had failed. At City Hall, Mayor Jimmy Walker compared our crossing of the Channel with Moses crossing the Red Sea, Caesar crossing the Rubicon, and Washington crossing the Delaware. In tennis, it was Tilden, long master of the courts. Among the women, there were the American champion, Molla Mallory, and the Frenchman, Suzanne Lenglen. But after a while, there was only one, the little girl with the eye shade and the poker face, Helen Wills. She won 15 championships, British and American. Most rugged of all the champions was Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler. When Dempsey worked out with his sparring partners, he had to hold back. If Jack was training for a big bout, he took every workout in dead earnest. Dempsey tangled with Purpo, the wild bull of the Pampas. And in 2 rounds, almost everything happened. Purpo knocked Dempsey out of the ring. But Dempsey bounced back and flattened Purpo for the count. He was champ for over 7 years, and then there was a new champion. Gene Tunney beat Dempsey in Philadelphia, but Dempsey got a second crack at him in Chicago, and the old-timers are still talking about this fight and the long count. Here it is. Dempsey knocks Tunney down. The referee won't start his count until Dempsey moves to a neutral corner. Tunney waits to the count of 9 and then goes on to win by a decision. But thousands of fight fans thought Dempsey had been robbed by that long count. got the official welcome at City Hall. And then after defeating Tom Heaney, he retired from the ring.
Tunney, it appeared, liked books, and so did a great many other Americans. They read the works of Michael Arlen and were spellbound by the superb style of Joseph Conrad, a Pole who had learned to write in English. Hundreds of thousands of Americans bought The Outline of History by that tremendously productive Englishman, H.G. Wells. Another great English writer, John Galsworthy, delighted the American reading public with his chronicles of the Forsyte family. There were scores of popular books by American authors, too, and a few brilliant ones, for it was a time of fresh and energetic creation in American writing.
A new sort of gadget began to cut into reading time. It had been known as the wireless, but it gradually changed its name to radio. The early broadcasters operated pretty much like the present ones, except that now they have air conditioning in the studios. It didn't take long for the new gadget to catch on, especially when there were so many new jazz bands on the air. You could get most of the sensational news from radio, too. There was the Hall Mills case, complete with a pig woman. She was a key witness in a murder mystery that had everybody baffled. Mrs. Hall's husband, a preacher, had been killed in a Jersey back road, and so had the wife of James Mills. No one ever figured out why.
Floyd Collins was another great dramatic story. Collins had been trapped in a Kentucky cave by a falling boulder, and the whole nation wanted to know from hour to hour what progress his rescuers were making. The youth had been exploring the narrow, twisting entrance to the cave when the rock had fallen and pinned his foot so he couldn't move. The rescuers planned to sink a shaft to intercept the tunnel at the point where Collins was trapped. But before they could finish it, Collins died after 18 days in the tunnel. The nation felt a genuine sense of frustration and defeat.
Tops on Broadway or even at a picnic were the glamorous stars of the Metropolitan Opera. Lawrence Tibbett was one of the promising homegrown baritones, and Rosa Ponselle was one of the best of the native warblers. Madam Schumann-Heink was a concert landmark, but she had made her early fame in Wagnerian opera. An early Missouri thrush was Marion Talley, meteoric soprano at the Metropolitan Opera House. And Grace Moore, a girl from Tennessee, one of the loveliest of them all. American music was growing up fast. George Gershwin, the most gifted of the young composers, moved back and forth between Broadway and the concert stage, was equally at home in both. Meanwhile, Irving Berlin went on turning out smash hits. The legit theater boomed along with the rest of the nation. There were plenty of good shows to take in, plenty of customers at the box office. Visiting entertainers from Europe, if they were as gifted as Harry Lauder, star of the English music halls, were certain of a generous reception in the United States. But Americans were loyal to their own products, too. The girls had just about what they have now. And Earl Carroll was the first to treat it on a deadpan mathematical basis.
Next, 12 and a half. Bust 34 and a half. Waist 23 and a half. Hip 35.
There was a craze for speed and more speed. At the automobile races, you could never tell when something would happen. But Ralph De Palma and Peter DePaulo were always the indestructible, unbeatable ones. Aviation was still kind of hazardous, too. You see, people had strange ideas, which almost worked. And there was one that looked like it ought to work. And one man who had theories about wings but couldn't run quite fast enough.
But in spite of real danger, aviation's pioneers kept on trying. Some experimented with gliders towed by planes. The best professionals had their troubles too. René Fonck, a French war ace, started out to fly from New York to Paris. He gunned his big plane, heavily loaded, down the runway. Tried hard to get her off the ground, but couldn't make it. 2 crewmen were lost in the crash, but Fonck lived to fly again. But no flyer received 1/10 of the adulation that came to Charles Augustus Lindbergh, who set off alone in a tiny plane to fly from New York to Paris. In Paris, Lindbergh was taken in tow by Ambassador Herrick, and French-American relations reached a new peak of friendliness. Back in New York, Lindbergh was given the greatest reception that anyone had ever had. The admiration for him in American hearts and minds was both deep and hysterical. Of New York, Al Smith, was proud and happy to be allowed to stand beside him.
In keeping with the liveliness of the period, President Coolidge accepted an honorary chieftaincy from the Sioux Indians amid ceremonial merriment at their South Dakota reservation. Leading Eagle was but mildly amused. Everybody was having a happy time. The automobile industry, for example, was booming. The cars themselves had certain features of a utilitarian order, such as running boards, driver visibility, and fresh air. The prices were right, too. The flivver was a thing of beauty, and when Henry Ford turned out his 15 millionth car, we knew the automobile age had really arrived. The earliest autos had become museum pieces, and Henry Ford, father of the American assembly line technique, sat proudly in his own first car, which he had made by hand. Production in industry was steadily increasing, and with it came a steady rise in national income and in international trade. Under the guidance of Charles Dawes and Owen D. Young, considerable efforts were made to help solve such knotty problems as Europe's war debts and reparations claims. During such prosperous times, everyone thought of peace. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, negotiated to outlaw war as an instrument of national policy, seemed to many to make perfect sense in those days. If Coolidge was not wildly enthusiastic, it was probably because he realized that if the pact had been a good gesture politically, it was also a futile one. Good political moves, like the negotiation of the pact, were not to be lightly regarded at that time. The presidential campaign of 1928 had been a tough one. The Democrats had convened at Houston, Texas, and Al Smith was their choice for president. He was nominated by Franklin Roosevelt, who lauded him as the happy warrior. Al Smith was a fighter and a man of character, but the odds against him were too great. The Republicans had nominated Herbert Hoover, and Hoover was just what the country seemed to need. An engineer, honest and competent, who knew commerce and industry. That's what the people wanted, and on election night in Times Square, the crowds waited excitedly for the results to come in. Years of prosperity with the unbeatable Republican ticket, Hoover and Curtis. Now it became Hoover's turn to ride up to the Capitol to take the oath of office. To most Americans as if the years of prosperity would go on forever, and the crowd before the Capitol was in a holiday mood as the ceremony got underway. Then the rain began to fall, but the spectators listened on quietly to Hoover's inaugural address. Another sort of storm was gathering that day, but it still hadn't broken when the Coolidges pulled out of Washington, headed for retirement.
Americans with a bankroll could make summer last the year round. Arthur Hammerstein wintered in Palm Beach. So did Mrs. George M. Cohan, Mrs. Sam Harris. Irene Castle, famed as a dancer, added glamour. Flo Ziegfeld with his wife, Billie Burke, and his daughter, Patricia, went in for the nautical life. Most of Broadway showed up in Florida at one time or other. Helen Morgan was one of the standbys. She was a star of Showboat. The girls, and the men too, got a kick out of the fashion parade. And the dresses were, well, they looked fine then. Count on finding His Honor Jimmy Walker, Mayor of New York, in the middle of things. Jimmy was always dapper and lively, with a smile for all comers. The Florida press agent's ideas got wackier and wackier. Florida had no patent on wackiness. You could whip up a Charleston contest anywhere in the country. That the nightlife was really jumping. There were plenty of customers, the butter and egg men with bankrolls they were steaming to get rid of. You could always make more, make it in the market, spend it in the name band club. Easy to land office business, and Texas Guinan with her gals kept customers roaring.
Iron is really the sugar coating on the cake of trouble, and many a sucker has cut himself too big a piece of cake. You understand?
Didn't last forever. The time came when the ticker tape in the broker's office told a new story. It was panic. 16.5 million shares of stock sold in a single day. Sold hopelessly, desperately, at any price. The forerunner of depression and crisis. So ended the golden playtime of the 20s. But beneath the froth, it was a decade of great achievements in many fields of work. In science, in industry, in education. No one was wise enough to turn the peace and prosperity of that decade into permanent peace and prosperity. But the nation had lived for a few brief years in a new kind of world where there was happiness and peace. And if that brief world ended, rudely and abruptly, there was still left in its pattern the hope of an America of abundance and fun, of peace and accomplishment, to be created again in other golden days still to come.